For what it's worth, I've gone on for years about the importance of thinking about the long term in relation to the environmental damage, the climate change, everything else.
Behind palace walls, one quiet bond held the monarchy together, and it wasn't with the Queen. Long before the world watched Charles ascend the throne, before the weight of crowns and centuries of royal tradition settled on his shoulders, there was a quiet presence at his side. Princess Anne, his sister. The one person who truly understood him not as a monarch or a figurehead, but as a man who never quite felt fully in control of his own life. While Camilla stood publicly by his side and his sons walked their own difficult paths, it was Anne who remained constant. Their bond didn't need grand gestures or public praise. It was rooted in something deeper: shared childhood, shared burdens, and an unspoken pact that they would always protect the institution, even when the family fractured. Their closeness was no accident. From their early days at Balmoral, they were raised in the same rigid palace routines, trained to mask emotion and uphold duty. But unlike the other royals, Anne never softened her truth to preserve feelings. She challenged Charles when others cowered. She told him what he needed to hear, not what he wanted. This brutal honesty didn't push them apart, it bound them closer. She was his compass during scandals, his mirror during failures, and the only one who could stare down a king and speak plainly. Behind closed doors, Charles confided in Anne the thoughts he didn't dare utter elsewhere. She wasn't just his sister, she became his anchor. In times of conflict, when the royal family splintered over divorce, betrayal, and media wars, it was Anne who played the role of unifier. Palace aides often whispered about her ability to calm tempers and offer clarity. Whether it was smoothing tensions between Charles and William or navigating the stormy waters after Harry's departure, Anne stood in the middle, not emotionally swayed, but steadfast and fair. Her presence wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Her influence was felt in the moments that mattered most. She didn't seek the spotlight. She didn't crave the applause. Yet behind every major royal resolution of the last decade, her hand was quietly at work. And as King Charles's health began to falter, that bond grew even stronger. While the public focused on Camilla's devotion, insiders knew it was Anne who Charles leaned on most. It wasn't a betrayal, it was reality. Camilla, though loyal, was part of the public narrative. Anne was part of his private truth. When Charles faced the most difficult decision of his reign, the one that would alter the future of the monarchy, he didn't confide in his sons. He didn't discuss it with his wife. He turned to Anne, because he knew that only she would understand the weight, the risk, and the legacy behind what he was about to do. And so, it was Anne, not a courtier, not a messenger, but Anne whom Charles entrusted to deliver the most pivotal message of his reign. A message that would ripple through the palace, shake royal foundations, and leave the queen consort in silent tears. But what exactly was this message? And why did it bring Camilla to tears? The nation saw a brave king, but no one knew how much pain he hid behind closed doors. When King Charles stepped onto the world stage after the death of Queen Elizabeth II, the world expected certainty, stability, continuity. But behind the royal facade, something else was unfolding, a private war the king could no longer ignore. What began as a routine concern, a common health check, slowly spiraled into something far more alarming. The palace initially told the public it was just an enlarged prostate, a condition that sounded manageable, routine. But insiders knew that. The situation shifted dramatically when, during a follow-up procedure, the doctors uncovered something much worse: cancer. The diagnosis was devastating. Charles, who had waited longer than any heir in British history to ascend the throne, now faced the cruel irony of fighting for his life just as he had finally received the crown. And yet, true to his upbringing, true to the centuries of royalty house AD tradition, Charles refused to show weakness. Even while enduring treatment, he insisted on attending state functions, reviewing policy documents, and maintaining a rigorous schedule that would exhaust a man in perfect health. His defiance wasn't vanity, it was duty. But inside palace walls, that duty was costing him dearly. Palace staff described moments that pierced the illusion. One recalled walking into his office to find the king gripping the edge of his desk, His weight pressed forward, his eyes closed, not in prayer, but in exhaustion. He was losing strength, yet wouldn't allow the cameras to see it. He would rest only briefly, then change into formal attire to host ambassadors, greet diplomats, or sign off on affairs of state. These weren't just acts of obligation, they were acts of resistance. Charles believed slowing down was surrendering to death. But those around him knew better. They saw the toll. They felt the unease. Through it all, Queen Camilla never wavered. She rearranged her schedule, canceled public appearances, and made quiet adjustments to be by his side during hospital visits. While cameras showed her smiling at charity events, she was silently preparing to shoulder more than she had ever anticipated. Her devotion, once questioned by the public, became undeniable. She was no longer just a controversial figure who had once divided the monarchy. She had become its quiet protector, managing both the man she loved and the kingdom he fought to serve. But even her presence couldn't ease the looming question. What would happen if Charles could no longer reign? Behind Buckingham Palace doors, discussions began to shift. A sense of urgency replaced formality. Senior aides whispered of contingency plans. The crown, though heavy, had to endure. And with each passing week, the talk grew louder. Not of abdication, not yet, but of succession, of preparation, of readiness. The future of the monarchy could not wait for the king to recover. And as Charles grew weaker, one name kept surfacing in whispered conversations: Prince William. While the world worried about the king, his son was already stepping into power quietly, confidently. As King Charles's health faltered behind gilded palace doors, Prince William was not standing idly by. In hushed corridors and private meeting rooms, a different kind of leadership was beginning to emerge, steady, calm, and strategic. With each week, William took on more than just ceremonial duties. He began receiving the same confidential government, briefings once reserved solely for the monarch. He chaired meetings that once fell under his father's exclusive purview. And without fanfare, he became the one ministers turned to for guidance and assurance. While the public still viewed Charles as their reigning king, the monarchy had already started moving to the rhythm of William's presence. Inside the palace, staff noticed the shift almost immediately. It wasn't just the added workload, it was the way William carried it. He was composed, focused, and deliberate, never flinching under pressure. Where others had crumbled under the weight of royal expectations, William absorbed it with a quiet strength that earned the respect of even the most seasoned aides. His ability to listen without ego, to act without overstepping, and to make decisions without delay began to turn heads. Even those who once viewed him as a figurehead saw something different now, a leader who had studied the throne his entire life and was now stepping into its shadow with undeniable confidence. But this transformation wasn't born in comfort. It came in the middle of a storm. With Catherine undergoing treatment and stepping back from public life, William had no choice but to carry their shared responsibilities alone. Her absence wasn't just a personal void, it was a public one. For years, the couple had projected an image of steady, modern royalty. Now, with Catherine out of the spotlight, William's every move became more visible, more scrutinized, more essential, and yet he never faltered. He represented the crown at diplomatic events, presided over military ceremonies, and even began managing internal affairs once dominated by the king. The shift was unmistakable. Public perception followed quickly. Polls across the UK and even the United States showed William gaining unprecedented favor. He was no longer just a royal son, he was seen as the monarch in waiting. His approval ratings soared, and commentators began openly speculating whether the monarchy was quietly transitioning right before their eyes. People looked at him and saw a man who blended tradition with empathy, formality with approachability. In a family often criticized for being out of touch, William had become the bridge. And with Charles struggling privately and Camilla stretched, thin, there was suddenly a space that only William could fill, and he filled it effortlessly. But what no one outside the palace knew was that this wasn't coincidence. It was the beginning of something larger, something intentional. The king was preparing for what came next, and William was already living it. He wasn't acting like a king. He was being shaped into one, day by day, duty by duty. Still, behind the formality and growing respect, an emotional storm was building elsewhere. Because while William quietly stepped into power, another conversation was happening in secret. A conversation that would shake the very core of the monarchy. And yet, none of this prepared Queen Camilla for the private conversation that changed everything. No guards, no ceremony. Just Princess Anne. And a message that left Queen Camilla speechless. It was a day soaked in silence, the kind of rain that seems to press against stone and memory alike. Windsor Castle, a fortress of tradition, had weathered centuries of storms. But what unfolded on that particular Tuesday afternoon would not be forgotten by those who witnessed it. Princess Anne, known for her unshakable resolve and near-military punctuality, arrived without warning. No convoy, no announcement. Just the low rumble of her Land Rover rolling across the wet courtyard as staff exchanged puzzled glances. She didn't pause to explain. She didn't need to. Her face said enough, set, stern, unreadable. She was carrying something weightier than protocol, the king's final private decision. Camilla was alone in the drawing room, the same room where monarchs had plotted wars, signed treaties, and whispered secrets that never reached daylight. She had been reading correspondence, managing appearances, keeping the machinery of the monarchy running while Charles rested. She wasn't expecting Anne. No one was. And when Anne entered without knocking, without waiting for introduction, it was clear this wasn't just a visit between sisters-in-law. This was royal blood delivering royal truth. And it wasn't going to be softened. For nearly 20 minutes, no one moved in or out of that room. Behind the heavy doors, there was no shouting, no outbursts. But the tension was seismic. Anne, ever the soldier, delivered Charles's decision with cold precision and personal ache. It wasn't about ceremony or optics. It was about the future. And it was final. Charles, battling illness and burdened by centuries of expectation, had made a choice. And Camilla was hearing it not from him, but from the sister he trusted above all others. When the doors finally creaked open, there was no fanfare, no instructions, just stillness. A lady in waiting, bringing tea as she had countless times before, entered quietly only to freeze at what she saw. Camilla, usually so composed, so polished in her restraint, sat motionless. Her hand trembled slightly over her mouth, a handkerchief with embroidered initials clenched between her fingers. Her eyes, red and unfocused, told a story of silent devastation. Anne stood by the window, facing outward, saying nothing. She didn't need to. The message had been delivered, and its impact was already written across the Queen's face. To outsiders, it might have seemed like just another royal discussion, but for those who understood the power dynamics of the monarchy, this was something else entirely. This wasn't simply about delegation or shared responsibility. This was a shift, a transfer. The moment the Queen realized that her place beside the king, the life she had spent years building, defending, and legitimizing, was quietly, irreversibly changing. It wasn't betrayal, it was transition. And it had arrived, not with trumpets or headlines, but with raindrops tapping on ancient glass and a sister's unwavering voice. So, what exactly had Charles told Anne to deliver, and why now? It hadn't happened in 200 years, and now King Charles wanted it for his son. The decision didn't come lightly. It came with the weight of history on its back. In a monarchy governed by tradition and preserved by cautious evolution, Charles had done the unthinkable. He reached into the past to shape the future, drawing from an event buried deep in royal memory, the regency of King George III. A time when power shifted, not through abdication or death, but by choice, by necessity. And now, after 2 centuries, Charles was prepared to do the same, not because he had lost his mind like his predecessor, but because he hadn't. His clarity, his awareness of time slipping, and his understanding of legacy made the decision all the more revolutionary. This wasn't abdication. This wasn't retreat. This was a calculated transfer of power, while retaining the crown in name. A living regency, forged not in scandal, but in strategy. Charles had lived long enough under the weight of the crown to understand that symbolic leadership was no longer enough. The world was changing faster than the palace could keep up. And in that race, it wasn't the past that needed preserving, but the future that needed shaping. William represented that future. And Charles knew that waiting until death would be too late to prepare him for what truly lay ahead. In private, Charles had begun sounding out the plan, whispered conversations with Princess Anne, always in hushed tones and out of reach of the royal bureaucracy. Timing was everything. The nation was still adjusting to a new monarch. The public hadn't yet fully let go of Queen Elizabeth's ghost. But the signs were already there. An ailing king, a rising heir, a monarchy that needed to pivot or perish. Charles's concern wasn't just about health, it was about relevance. He had watched public sentiment tilt toward youth, toward transparency, toward a monarch that embodied both tradition and modernity. And as much as it hurt, he knew that monarch wasn't him anymore. The regency proposal was simple in concept, but monumental in consequence. William would assume the day-to-day responsibilities of the monarch, signing state documents, presiding over council meetings, engaging with foreign dignitaries. Charles would remain king in title, guiding, advising, mentoring. But power, real power, would quietly begin to shift. It was a framework designed not for survival, but for continuity. A bridge between eras. Charles had waited his entire life for the throne, but he had waited long enough to know that holding on to it too tightly could break it. Behind closed doors, Charles and Anne mapped out how to reveal it, how to soften the impact. They both knew that this change would not be met with universal celebration. It would raise questions, it would stir whispers, and above all, it would affect Camilla in ways even Charles couldn't predict. Because this wasn't just about titles. This was about roles, about purpose, about identity within the royal machine. And for a woman who had fought decades of public scorn to stand beside her husband as queen, this shift felt like an erasure, a quiet fading from the very spotlight she had once been forbidden to stand in. But the king, resolute in his decision, believed in the long game. He believed that guiding William now while he was still alive, still alert, was the only way to ensure that the institution endured beyond the next crisis, the next headline, the next funeral. It was a choice rooted not in weakness, but in wisdom. He wasn't stepping back. He was stepping aside. And in that moment, Charles showed the rarest kind of royal power, not holding on, but letting go for the sake of something bigger. But for Camilla, this wasn't just a political shift, it was a personal heartbreak. She stood by him through it all, and now it was slipping away in silence. Camilla had survived the storm of public hatred. She had endured being the most vilified woman in the kingdom, shunned by tabloids and jeered by crowds. For decades, she waited patiently, silently, until the world changed. And she was finally embraced, not just as Charles's wife, but as his queen. She had earned her place at his side, not through grandeur, but grit. Through scandal, illness, loss, and reform, she stayed loyal. She had transformed. And now, just when it seemed the struggle had finally borne fruit, it was being taken from her in a single, hushed conversation. Not by decree, not by scandal, but by time and the king's quiet surrender to it. The moment Anne delivered Charles's final wish, Camilla didn't speak. At first, she simply nodded, listening as though the message hadn't fully landed. But later, when the door shut behind Anne and silence returned to the room, the weight of it collapsed onto her like a wave. A palace aide who entered minutes later would never forget what she saw. Camilla hunched over a side table, hand trembling over her mouth, tears spilling quietly down her cheeks. And then came the whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. He waited his whole life for this. It wasn't anger. It was sorrow. A deep, piercing ache not just for Charles, but for everything she had endured to reach this point beside him. She wasn't grieving a title. She was grieving relevance. For years, she had fought to prove she belonged not just to Charles, but to the monarchy. She had modernized, humanized, softened what had once been seen as cold. But now she was being asked without warning, without consent, to step back, to become ceremonial again, a supporter in name only. She felt the walls closing in, the silence of the palace shifting against her. Her calendar lightened. Her presence was no longer requested at certain meetings, and for the first time since their marriage, she felt herself being gently but unmistakably pushed aside. In private, Camilla began making inquiries. She met with legal advisors and constitutional experts, trying to understand what this change would mean not just for her duties, but for her legacy. Would she remain queen consort in name? Would her role diminish to historical footnote as William and Catherine rose in prominence? These weren't questions of pride. They were questions of identity. And in those moments of private uncertainty, she made a choice to support the institution that had reshaped her, even as it seemed to unmake her role within it. She began mentoring Catherine quietly. No fanfare, no public announcements, just private notes, gentle guidance, and unspoken acknowledgement of the new reality. Camilla had once fought to be seen. Now, she was preparing someone else for the light. Catherine, still healing, still finding her footing in the middle of a storm, received Camilla's gestures not as strategy, but as solidarity. And though the world couldn't yet see it, a silent passing of knowledge had begun. One queen to another, one chapter to the next. And while Camilla mourned a fading crown, the spotlight turned toward the next king. To many, he was already the new king, they just hadn't made it official yet. While Charles quietly receded behind palace doors, Prince William stepped into the light with a quiet certainty that captivated the public. He wasn't crowned, but he didn't need to be. In the eyes of millions, the crown had already begun to shift, not by declaration, but by presence. Approval ratings soared across the UK and even beyond the Commonwealth. In America, where monarchy was once rejected, William emerged as the most admired royal figure. His composed demeanor, emotional intelligence, and refusal to play politics resonated with a world desperate for stability. And for a royal family still scarred by recent scandals and bitter divisions, William was becoming more than just an heir, he was becoming a symbol of repair. His growing presence wasn't accidental. Behind the scenes, William was increasingly present in state matters. He began attending more diplomatic functions, representing the crown at international forums, and hosting quiet meetings with world leaders who treated him as an equal, not a substitute. The tone around him shifted. Government officials started looking to him not as a future monarch, but as a current authority. Private councils once led by Charles now welcomed William into their most sensitive discussions. His grasp of policy, his calm amid crisis, and his thoughtful judgment gave reassurance not just to insiders, but to the nation at large. What made William's rise even more remarkable was his ability to carry the past into the future. He understood the gravity of royal tradition, but he refused to be bound by it. He greeted war veterans with solemn respect, then turned around and discussed mental health with teenage volunteers. He wore the weight of royal history with grace, yet refused to become a relic of it. This balance between reverence and relevance became the hallmark of his leadership. And in a world where monarchies are often questioned, William found a way to make the institution feel alive, human, and perhaps even necessary. Alongside him, though quieter now due to her health, Catherine remained an integral part of the public perception. Together, they projected unity, compassion, and a modern vision of royalty. Their choice to raise their children privately, shielded from unnecessary spectacle, only strengthened their image. They weren't performing royalty. They were living it on their own terms. This family-first approach resonated deeply, especially with younger generations who had long felt disconnected from the traditions of the crown. For the first time in years, people saw the monarchy not as a crumbling relic, but as something evolving before their eyes. At a time of uncertainty, William stood steady. And for the people exhausted by politics, weary from global crises, and wary of scandal, his quiet strength became a point of national comfort. He didn't campaign, he didn't demand, but somehow he became the monarch many already believed in. The nation was ready, the palace was adjusting, and history, it seemed, was inching toward his feet. But for Camilla, the transition was not about the crown, it was about losing herself. Once the backbone of a king, now a shadow behind the throne. Camilla had once been the storm, the scandal, the woman who shattered tradition. and then somehow rebuilt it. She had stood beside Charles as the monarchy transformed, absorbing criticism, rewriting her legacy in real time, and slowly gaining public trust. But after the regency was set in motion, everything she had fought for began to vanish, not with hostility, but with absence. It wasn't immediate. It didn't come with harsh words or formal declarations. It came with subtle omissions: a missing name on a guest list, a closed-door meeting she used to attend, a briefing that never reached her desk. The palace didn't need to explain. She understood. Her role, once central, began to dissolve quietly. Staff members who once rushed to consult her now checked with others. Her calendar thinned. Her advice, once sought after in family matters and royal engagements, was no longer necessary. Decisions were being made without her. Public engagements, previously anchored by her presence, were redirected to William and Catherine. Media coverage followed suit. Headlines that once debated her every move now focused on the new royal generation. The cameras turned, and Camilla stood in the fading light. What the world didn't see was the grief she carried behind the formality. Not grief for titles or prestige, but grief for meaning. After years spent carving a space in a system that never wanted her, Camilla now found herself edged out by that same machine. She had softened the image of a monarchy once cold and stoic. She had made Charles more human, more accessible, more modern. But now, with her husband stepping back and William stepping up, Camilla's purpose began to blur. She was still queen, consort in name. But in practice, she was watching a role she once defined slip through her hands. The hardest part wasn't the silence from the palace, it was the silence inside herself. She had built her identity around resilience, around proving people wrong. And she had. But no one tells you what to do when the battle is over, and the world simply moves on. She had prepared herself for backlash, but not for invisibility. And that was the true heartbreak. Not scandal, not rejection, but irrelevance. She wasn't needed anymore. Not in the way she had been. Not where it mattered most. Still, she endured. With grace. With dignity. She attended the events she was asked to attend. She smiled when the press asked if she was proud of William. She nodded when crowds cheered for Catherine. But behind it all, there was a quiet ache, a longing for the days when her voice echoed in palace halls, when her presence had weight. Now, she watched from the sidelines. The queen, who had once helped heal the crown, now stood apart from it, no longer shaping the future, but observing it as a bystander. Do you believe King Charles made the right choice? Or was it too soon to pass the torch? Drop your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.